Imagine being crowned queen only to lose it all just 3 years later. Accused of treason, incest, and facing execution by your own husband. That's the dramatic story of Anne Boleyn, the second wife of King Henry VIII and the mother of Queen Elizabeth II.
Oh.
Today we're diving deep into her world. Was she really this ambitious social climber history often portrays, or was there more to her story? Let's unpack the truth behind the legend.
What's often overlooked is that Anne lived in a time of immense change, a world on the cusp of religious revolution. To understand her, we need to step back and picture the Tudor court, a place of lavish parties, political maneuvering, and the ever-present pressure to produce a male heir.
That sounds like a pressure cooker. So tell me about Anne's early life. What kind of influences shaped her?
Well, Anne was born between 1501 and 1507 into a family that was cleverly climbing the social ladder through strategic marriages and smart investments. This wasn't a family content with simply accepting their place. They were ambitious and understood the levers of power.
So Anne grew up surrounded by a family that knew how to play the game. That must have influenced her.
Absolutely. And her education further honed her skills. At just 13, she was sent to the prestigious Habsburg court, known for its cultural influence and refinement. Imagine a young Anne navigating that world, absorbing languages, customs, and ideas that would give her a distinct edge.
From the Habsburgs to the French court. She really got around, didn't she? Wasn't the French court known for being, shall we say, a bit scandalous?
There's this popular myth that the French court was all wild parties and affairs, but during Anne's time, it was actually quite a sheltered experience. Queen Claude, whom Anne served, was deeply religious and constantly pregnant, leading a much more reserved life than history often suggests.
So no racy French love affairs to fuel the rumors.
Not exactly, but her time in France was still significant. While there, she was exposed to the Protestant Reformation sweeping across Europe, a movement challenging the very authority of the Catholic Church. Imagine the impact of these radical ideas on a young woman already known for her sharp wit and independent thinking.
Okay, so now we have Anne in her early 20s back in England and making her grand debut at the Tudor court. What was the reaction?
Well, the Tudor court was a hotbed of intrigue and ambition. Everyone was vying for King Henry VIII's favor. But Anne, with her wit, charm, and continental sophistication, quickly stood out.
And didn't she even participate in those elaborate court pageants?
She did. These weren't just frivolous entertainments. They were carefully orchestrated displays of power and status. We even have descriptions of what she wore: white satin with yellow accents and a headdress of Venetian gold. It was a clear statement of her presence and ambition.
But amidst the glamour, there were also whispers about her appearance, weren't there?
Yes, some accounts criticized her looks, claiming she had a crooked nose and even an extra finger. It's important to remember that many of these descriptions were spread by her enemies, highlighting the viciousness of court politics.
It's amazing how quickly rumors could spread even back then. And speaking of rumors, Anne wasn't the first Boleyn sister to attract Henry's attention, was she?
That's right. Anne's older sister, Mary, was already a maid of honor to Queen Catherine of Aragon and became Henry's mistress. Unlike the rumors surrounding Anne, Mary's affair is a confirmed historical fact.
It seems attracting the king's attention ran in the family.
It certainly did. But by 1526, Henry, desperate for a male heir and increasingly frustrated with Catherine's inability to produce one, set his sights on Anne.
And this is where things get really interesting, right? Because Henry didn't initially want to marry her.
Exactly. He wanted Anne as a mistress, not a wife. He was used to getting what he wanted and probably assumed she would fall in line like her sister. But Anne was different. She was playing a much more strategic game.
I can imagine Henry was quite surprised by her resistance.
He certainly was. We actually have some of his love letters to Anne, filled with passionate pleas for her affection. It's fascinating to see how his language shifts over time, becoming more intense, almost desperate as she continues to rebuff his advances.
It sounds like Anne was calling the shots. What was her strategy?
By refusing to give in, she elevated her own status. She knew that becoming just another royal mistress would diminish her power and jeopardize her future. So she played hard to get, spending time away from court, making Henry work for her affection.
She was a shrewd player. And while all this romantic drama was unfolding, there was also a major shift happening in England's religious landscape.
Right. Remember Anne's exposure to the Protestant Reformation in France? She started sharing those reformist ideas with Henry, introducing him to texts that challenged the Pope's authority and advocated for a more direct relationship with God.
So Anne was a key influence in Henry's break from the Catholic Church.
Absolutely. Henry, already frustrated with the Pope's refusal to grant him an annulment from Catherine, was intrigued by these ideas. and perhaps unintentionally planted the seeds that would lead to the English Reformation.
It sounds like she had a much deeper impact on history than many people realize.
She did. And it's important to remember that Anne wasn't just manipulating Henry. She was a genuine believer in reform. She truly wanted to see the church change. But she was also caught between her faith, her ambition, and this whirlwind romance with a king who would stop at nothing to get what he wanted.
What a tangled web. So we've got religious upheaval, political maneuvering, and a king obsessed. Where does the story go from here?
Well, we left off with Henry completely captivated by Anne questioning the very foundations of the Catholic Church. He was determined to marry her, and these new religious ideas fueled his desire to finally break free from Catherine of Aragon.
So how did Henry, a king used to getting his way, manage to get his annulment when the Pope was so resistant?
He couldn't simply defy the Pope. He needed to outmaneuver him, and that's where his new advisor, Thomas Cromwell, comes in. Cromwell was a master of political maneuvering and saw an opportunity to exploit the growing anti-clerical sentiment in England.
So Cromwell was like the architect of Henry's break with Rome.
Absolutely. He orchestrated this brilliant, if cynical, campaign highlighting supposed abuses within the Catholic Church, presenting Henry as the solution. He would be the head of a new church, the Church of England, free from the Pope's control.
Wow, what a bold move. So Henry gets his annulment, marries Anne, and she becomes queen. Did she finally get her fairy tale ending?
Not quite. Even with the crown, life for Anne was anything but a fairy tale. The pressure to produce a male heir was immense, and the birth of their daughter Elizabeth was a huge disappointment.
Wait, Elizabeth as in the Queen Elizabeth I?
The very same. Imagine the weight of those expectations on Anne's shoulders. Every move she made was scrutinized. The birth of a daughter, though a joyous occasion, didn't secure the future of the Tudor dynasty in the way a son would have.
That's a lot to live up to.
Yeah.
And to make matters worse, she went on to have a series of miscarriages, right?
Yes, tragically so. This put her in an incredibly vulnerable position, especially as Henry's eye began to wander toward one of her own maids of honor, Jane Seymour.
Oh no, a betrayal from within her own household. That's brutal.
It was a devastating blow. And with Henry unable to secure another annulment, he turned to his trusted advisor, Cromwell, to find a way out of the marriage.
What did Cromwell do?
Sensing an opportunity to eliminate a political rival and gain further favor with the king, Cromwell began to weave a web of accusations against Anne. He used rumors, half-truths, and even outright fabrications to paint her as an adulteress and a traitor.
How awful. What sort of evidence did he use?
He seized upon a seemingly innocent remark Anne made to a courtier, twisting it into evidence of treason. And then he orchestrated a series of charges accusing her of having affairs with 5 men, including her own brother, George Boleyn.
But accusing her of incest with her own brother. That's monstrous.
It was a particularly damaging accusation, a taboo that shocked the court and effectively sealed Anne's fate. It's important to remember that in the Tudor court, perception was often more important than reality, and Cromwell was a master manipulator creating the illusion of guilt.
What happened next?
In May of 1536, Anne and George were arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Just 2 weeks later, they were tried separately. The outcome, however, was a foregone conclusion.
They didn't stand a chance, did they?
It was a sham trial from the start. The jury, comprised of men too afraid to defy the king, found both Anne and her brother guilty. And just like that, Anne was stripped of her title, her power, and her freedom.
What was her reaction to all of this? Did she confess?
Anne maintained her innocence to the very end. During her final confession, she admitted to jealousy but denied any wrongdoing. Many historians believe this is further proof of her innocence.
I guess she had nothing left to lose, right?
Exactly. She had everything to gain by confessing. She could have potentially saved her soul from eternal damnation, but she refused to lie, even when facing death. It speaks volumes about her character and her unwavering commitment to the truth.
It's a powerful testament to her strength. So what happened on the day of her execution?
On May 19, 1536, Anne was led to a scaffold erected near the Tower of London. In a bizarre act of mercy, Henry had arranged for a skilled swordsman to perform the execution, a quicker, supposedly less painful death than the traditional acts.
Was Henry trying to ease his conscience?
It's hard to say. His compassionate gesture can't erase the fact that he orchestrated Anne's downfall. He was, after all, the one who condemned her to death. And even in death, Anne would have her revenge.
How so?
Her daughter Elizabeth would eventually ascend to the throne, becoming one of England's most iconic monarchs and solidifying the Protestant Reformation that her mother had championed.
It's almost poetic justice, isn't it?
Yeah.
Anne, denied a son and accused of treason, ultimately gives England its most celebrated queen, Elizabeth I. It really is quite remarkable. Even after being branded a traitor and executed, Anne's bloodline went on to shape England's future in a way she probably never could have imagined.
And that's just one layer of her legacy. Even though Henry tried to erase her and continued to captivate the imagination of the public, her story has been told and retold for centuries in books, plays, and even films.
It's like everyone has their own interpretation of Anne Boleyn.
Hmm.
What do you think accounts for this lasting fascination?
Well, her story has all the elements of a gripping drama, ambition, love, betrayal, and ultimately tragedy. But beyond the drama, I think it's Anne's complexity that draws people in. Was she a victim of circumstance, a pawn in Henry's game? Or a savvy player who underestimated the ruthlessness of Tudor politics? There's no easy answer.
It's like a historical puzzle with so many pieces. We've talked about the religious upheaval, the political maneuvering, the personal dramas. But for our listener, what would you say are the most important takeaways from Anne's story?
For me, it's a reminder that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about real people making choices, often with devastating consequences. Anne's story highlights the dangers of ambition in a world where power was concentrated in the hands of men like Henry VIII.
It's hard to imagine how much courage it took for a woman to challenge the status quo back then.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder how different things might have been if she had been born in a different time, a time when women had more agency and a voice in their own destiny.
It's a powerful thought. Her story definitely raises a lot of questions about the role of women in power, the abuse of power, and the price of challenging the established order.
And those questions are still relevant today, aren't they? We're still grappling with issues of gender equality, the abuse of power, and the struggle for individual agency. Anne's story, though, rooted in the 16th century, speaks to the timeless human experience.
It's a reminder that we can learn a lot from the past, both from the triumphs and the tragedies. So for our listener, if they were to take away just one thing from our deep dive into Anne Boleyn's life, what would you want it to be?
I think it would be this: behind the myths and the legends, there was a real woman. She was complex, intelligent, and ultimately a victim of her time. But even in death, she left an undeniable mark on history. Her daughter, Elizabeth, would go on to rule England for nearly half a century, ushering in a golden age. Anne's bloodline, her spirit, her fight for reform, it all played a role in shaping the course of history.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And I think it really captures the essence of what makes Anne Boleyn such an enduring and fascinating figure. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what are your final thoughts for our listener?
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the stories that shape our world. You never know what you might discover.
Well said. And for our listener, we hope this deep dive has given you a new perspective on Anne Boleyn and a deeper appreciation for the complexities of history. Thanks for joining us on this journey of discovery.